to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're discussing the pressing need for the nonprofit sector to embrace technology to survive and thrive in the future. Leaders in the sector recently joined forces to launch the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, which aims to build a digitally enabled nonprofit sector, where Canada's nonprofits use data and tech to advance their mission and multiply their impact. Charity Village is proud to be a partner in this important initiative. Joining us today is Katie Gibson, the Vice President of the CIO Strategy Council and the co-founder of the Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, to tell us more. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'm delighted to be here.
First off, I want to really start by having you introduce us to the work of the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience. How did it come together and how did it get started?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So the Centre has come together to respond to a simple fact, which is that nonprofit digital transformation is no longer just an organizational challenge. It's a sector imperative. And I think we're really doing our sector a disservice if we leave it to each executive director or each nonprofit board or each staff member to figure out their digital transformation journey on their own. So let me give you the example of cybersecurity. In that case, nonprofits exist on a spectrum. Some are in denial that they could be the subject of a ransomware attack, or they aren't even aware of the wealth of sensitive personal data that they have in their custody, which could be the subject of a data breach. Others are very aware of their vulnerabilities, but they don't have the staff bandwidth or the funding to deal with it. And then there are some that are in quite good shape. But I think what's clear to us is that if we tackle this issue at a sector level, it's going to be more efficient and less duplicative than leaving each individual nonprofit to solve this for themselves. And I'd mentioned my friend Charles Buchanan, who's CEO of Technology Helps. What he says is when it comes to technology, the nonprofit sector operates like a feudal village where each organization builds and maintains its own road network and its own water pipes and its own sewage systems. So we created the center to play that role of convener and coordinator so that we really can operate more like a functioning whole.
So what is the current landscape looking like in terms of nonprofit digitization in Canada? Certainly, we saw a lot of embrace of technology during the pandemic when it was critical for their continued functioning and operations and fundraising. How successful have nonprofits been in moving the needle on this, particularly since COVID hit in 2020?
So on the whole, Canada's nonprofits haven't fully embraced digital tools. We have a nice survey from Canada Helps of nonprofit digital skills that was done last year. And only a quarter of those organizations surveyed rated their knowledge and skill level as very good for general office operational software. Not even tackled by the survey were more advanced technologies that are now mainstream in other sectors like artificial intelligence and machine learning. The survey also didn't delve into data capacity specifically, but we know the same challenges exist there and that the data challenge and the technology challenge are very much intertwined. But there certainly is cause for optimism. So SAGE surveyed Canadian nonprofits and found that 9 in 10 nonprofits are embracing some form of digital transformation. About a quarter are going through the process to become digital-first organizations, and then about half are in the process of digitizing key processes. And what's really interesting is Twilio just put out some research based on UK and US clients, so not Canadian specifically, but what they found was that nonprofits are actually having more digital engagement with their program participants than B2C or business to consumer companies are having with their customers. So I think that's a really exciting nugget and a positive direction. And of course, you mentioned COVID. No doubt that the pandemic has really opened a window of opportunity there. So interestingly, if we look at that SAGE survey, they actually found that 51% of nonprofits reported that their finance and accounting processes were digitized during 2021. So massive sort of adoption happening. We know that this digital adoption did happen under duress in many cases because, suddenly we had to serve clients remotely and we had to work remotely. And in many cases, we had to do more with less. But I think, more than just accelerating the adoption of specific digital tools, I think the pandemic has really changed mindsets on the strategic importance of technology. in delivering on our mission. And now is the time that we can really build on that momentum.
Well, some of the SAGE data certainly is really fascinating. In fact, we interviewed Daniel O from SAGE very recently on some of those findings. So I think it'll really add to the data that the center is using in order to do its work. And I'd love to know what the center is actually working on currently, and what's the key priority for you right now?
The key priorities are defined by the group of collaborators around the table. So right now we have 5 co-founders who are providing oversight and direction and delivering the day-to-day work. So that's Centraide du Grand Montréal, Imagine Canada, N10 based in the US, but they operate in Canada, CETSI, Tamarack Institute, and then my organization, the CIO Strategy Council. And then we also have more than 175 advisors representing really the range: large national organizations, small local nonprofits, academics, policymakers, consultants and vendors, and really everybody in between. So our priorities are defined by the group, and the center is really functioning as that convener and coordinator. So far, we've initiated 4 working groups. So we started with one group focused on cybersecurity, which I mentioned at the top, really a critical burning issue for a lot of organizations, and one that can benefit from a sector-wide approach. We also have a group focusing on building sector motivation and readiness. We don't want to be the frog in the boiling water, and I think we do need to build this sense of urgency for digital. We also have a group focused on building staff digital literacy and skills. This is an absolutely critical element and needs to be part of every effort around digital transformation. And soon we'll be launching a group focused on mobilizing grant makers to invest in digital, which is often identified as a missing piece in the puzzle.
Well, can we drill down on some fundamentals? I mean, what is your message to nonprofits as to why digitization is so important for nonprofits today? In other words, for those who've yet to get started, why should they invest in this kind of work?
To answer that, let's rewind the clock back to the 90s and ask the question that many were asking then, which is, what is email all about, and why should I use it? And does my organization really need a website? I'm certainly old enough to remember relying on posters and mailouts and fax machines and phone banks to get the word out about events and meetings, lugging around boxes of brochures. Did building websites and getting everybody on email require investments and training and change management? Absolutely. But now, in 2022, I sincerely hope that the utility of a website and email are self-evident. But the point is that, tech keeps evolving. So this is really about using the tools available today to do our work better. And as time passes, what yesterday's, sort of new innovation is just today's business as usual. So this works on 2 levels. One is internal. It's about making our internal processes more efficient and more automated where possible. So for example, I use a scheduling tool so people can just pick a free time in my calendar to meet up. And that saves me dozens of back and forth emails, scheduling meetings each week. Experts estimate that nonprofit staff spend 30% of their time on routine administrative tasks. So if we can free up that time, we can really liberate them to work on those tasks that can't be automated and that do require human connection. So that's the internal case. The other is external, and fundamentally, this is about better meeting the needs of our beneficiaries. So, as a parent, I'm delighted that I can now visit the pediatrician without having to take a half day off work and drag my kid across town. But this isn't just about, offering those same services that we've always offered and just offering them virtually. It can be about using a chatbot to answer questions outside of your normal operating hours. Or it can be about enabling beneficiaries to actually do their own screening, check their own eligibility, and register for services themselves. So really about, rethinking that relationship with the beneficiary, putting them at the center and delivering services in the way that they want to be met. Bottom line, none of this is about technology as an end in itself. It's all about how technology can be used to meet our mission and multiply our impact.
And today, what are the biggest barriers preventing the nonprofit sector from making any progress in this area? Have things shifted recently? What do you see as the big challenges in making this happen?
I can answer that at the organizational level and also at the sector level. So, for organizations, if you ask nonprofits themselves, they'll say money and skills. Lack of funding is the number one barrier cited in the Canada Help survey for why organizations may not be using software and digital tools to their fullest capacity. And the number two barrier cited is lack of skills and expertise and knowledge. So that's, if you ask the nonprofits. Others, like consultants who have worked with a whole range of organizations, they also certainly speak to a lack of urgency. In this case, it may be a lack of interest on the part of the organization's leadership. So they don't see that this should be prioritized. And it really is up to the executive director with the board support to prioritize digital and to create that urgency. Then if you ask those EDs, they'll often cite staff's resistance to change as a barrier. So, a lot of different pieces and a lot of different answers depending on who you're speaking with. I think if we step back and think about this from a sector level, a big barrier has been this lack of a coordinated approach. Right now, unfortunately, technology is actually a barrier to mission in many organizations. Many organizations don't have that internal technology skill and capacity, but also don't have extra budget lying around and resources to outsource to IT firms and consultants. And yet there are lots of commonalities among the tech needs of nonprofits. So that's really where we see the need for a coordinated and sector-wide approach.
And what do you see as the biggest benefits for organizations who make a commitment to digital transformation? What's the upside for them? Like, what is it that you tell them could be, certainly life-changing or, operationally changing for these organizations?
It's an impact multiplier. So on the operations side, it's cost savings, it's time saving, it's additional revenue, it's additional capabilities. On the client side, it's increasing your geographic reach, serving more people, having more accessibility of your services, better quality service, better outcomes from better data. Really across the board, there can be more engagement with supporters and donors. So, if we think about the situation that a lot of nonprofits are in, where they have long wait lists, where demand far outstrips supply, that's where technology can really make an impact. Likewise, in organizations where staff are being asked to do too much with too little, where there's a lot of burnout, there's high turnover, again, that's where technology, if you're taking away those routine administrative tasks and freeing up staff to focus on the work that's meaningful to them, you can really address some of that burnout.
So is there a role for funders and grant makers to play in terms of supporting the digitization for the sector? How do they fit into the big picture?
Funders play an absolutely critical role. As I mentioned, the lack of funding is the number one barrier cited in the Canada Help survey for why organizations may not be using software and digital tools to their fullest capacity. Right now, organizations just don't have the funding to invest in the basic digital infrastructure required to operate a 21st century organization. And that's why we're convening grant makers and nonprofits in a working group specifically focused on mobilizing grant makers to invest in digital capacity. We know that we need to know more about the problem, and then we can start thinking about sector level solutions. But certainly we know one of the problems. We hear over and over from nonprofits that technology is usually considered overhead, and it gets squeezed into that admin line along with the other quote unquote non-program costs. N10, one of the co-founders of the center, they have an equity guide for nonprofit technology, and it has some very good advice for funders that starts with a pretty simple guideline that funders should invest appropriately in technology. Then you sort of get into the question of what does that really mean? What does that include? A few pointers there. Let's, excuse me, grant makers should include technology expenses as part of program budgets, not squeeze it into that overhead bucket. The funding should include technology capacity building and staff skill building and change management, really everything to make the adoption of that technology successful. Another piece of that is that funders should provide support for selecting new systems rather than expecting organizations to already know what the right tech tool will be. We know that selection and procurement can be difficult and time consuming and costly. But also, from experience, N10 and others have found that funders really shouldn't mandate specific technologies or approaches, and that ultimately the organization is going to know its needs best. Of course, the other piece is I do think we need funders to think expansively about how to support a strong digital nonprofit ecosystem.
Well, can you talk about, on another sort of tact, can you talk about digital equity and explain what this is and why it's so important for nonprofits to consider?
Digital equity has a few different components. So if we start with a traditional view of digital inclusion, we really, there are thinking about universal internet access and connectivity. We're thinking about community members that have the digital skills and literacy and the devices available to use technology. Then I think we have to layer on delivery capacity. So there we're looking at, do nonprofits have the skills and tools to deliver technology optimized services to their users? So building out that sort of inclusion lens a little bit. But there's another aspect of this, and underpinning all of this is rights and equity in a digital society. And we really need to take an intersectional approach to that. So what happens when a police force decides to use artificial intelligence, or when governments use AI to determine benefits? How can we start to put regulatory guardrails around new technologies? In my view, we really need to start building the capacity of the nonprofit sector and of civil society to engage in digital policy advocacy. And that's a really kind of critical piece of the digital equity framework. And again, I'd recommend N10's Tech Equity Guide as a good resource. Really does dive into this from an organizational perspective and gives quite tangible and concrete recommendations.
Okay, well, I want to close by giving you an opportunity to tell nonprofits about how they can get involved with the work that the center is doing, either to support it or working towards their own digital transformation. Maybe you could give us some tips for people in our audience who might be interested in either supporting you or actually going through this journey themselves.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, please. All are welcome to join us. You can visit our website, which is ccndr.ca. You can sign up for a working group there or just add yourself to our mailing list to stay updated. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We provide more frequent news and updates on the topic of nonprofit digital transformation. And really, we know that this is a massive challenge. There's no silver bullet, but with the right people around the table, we can really solve this.
Well, Katie, we at Charity Village are looking forward to working with you and the many supporters that you have at the center for this important work to help the sector embrace data and tech to build resilience for the future. Thank you for your insights and advice. I know it will be so helpful for nonprofits across Canada.